for attending. I'm sorry we're a bit thin on the ground, but more people may join us. I think it's a Monday, getting close to elections and things. Well, I think this is a really interesting report. So we're going to see whether we can make some progress. I think we're going to start, if we can, it's much more of a discussion that I think we want to have with you around the independence and powers of the inspectorate, because I think that comes up as a key issue. And I probably want to start with the inspectors, if I may, so take your chance as to who goes with it. And two of you are leaving. You haven't left, have you? You've left. You've left. Mr. Vine has left. In fact, wrote to us about leaving, and Nick Hardwick has just declared that he's not going to seek reappointment. So that makes it even more interesting, because we hope you'll be a bit freer in what you say. So basically, do you think the way in which you are appointed, the way in which you are accountable, and the way in which the budget you have is determined enables you to be really the independent inspector of the service for which you have responsibility? Who wants to start with it? John looks as if he's going to go with that.
Well, I started, obviously I was appointed in 2008. It was a unique opportunity to set up an inspectorate from scratch. I mean, from the start, I always felt I had the resources to do the job effectively. The budget initially was 3.5 million. That's reduced, but in line with Home Office budgets. So from the point of view of resources, I've always felt that I've had the resources to provide an effective inspectorate. I'm not Her Majesty's inspector. There was no royal warrant that came with the post. In legislation, it's Chief Inspector of what was then the Border and Immigration Agency, which then changed to Chief Inspector of the UK Border Agency. And the word independent was adopted by me with the agreement of the Home Office and the Home Affairs Select Committee, because what was very important from the outset was to establish independence and a sense of independence, because the inspectorate was born out of a crisis in immigration which had led to some considerable changes in government in 2007. And so establishing an inspectorate that followed on from John Reid's white paper, which was about building confidence in the immigration system and for it to be transparent and trusted, I was very keen to establish independence from the outset. And in the way I did that was to ensure that we did very well evidenced reports, very thorough reports, and that we presented them as factually and as evidence-based as we could to the Home Office. And from the outset, of course, I wanted to ensure that we were focused on improvement, because inspection is about improving things. So from my point of view, yes, it was a great opportunity to establish independence from the start. It was very difficult to do that, because there was no tradition of inspection in this area of public policy. So when I'd been a Chief Constable, I'd prepared for inspection by the Police Inspectorate. There was no sense of any of that being done when I started inspecting borders and immigration. There was no preparation, no culture of it, and that has been a long journey to try and establish that sort of ethos.
Did the lack of a royal warrant make a difference to how the inspectorate was perceived? Do you think that would have established an element of credibility right from the beginning, as opposed to establishing credibility on the force of, dare I say it, your own personality, your own drive, how you wanted to see the infrastructure progress?
Yes, I think it would have helped. But I think what happened was that the provisions which created the inspectorate were inserted into an immigration bill that was passing through Parliament at the time of the foreign national prisoner crisis, and at the time when the asylum backlog was exposed, when John Reid came in as Home Secretary. There'd also been a push, I think, in previous year, just before the creation of the inspectorate, to consider amalgamation of inspectorates. So I think there were a number of factors which mitigated against the royal warrant, but in short, it would have helped. I think it would, yes.
Can I just take you back to the question? Because, you actually wrote to us when we took evidence, I think it was on foreign prisoners, there'd been delay in the Home Office of publication of your report. So can I go back to question, because I think you've got a rather interesting perspective on this. So were you appointed in an independent way? Are you accountable in an independent way? And does your budget give you that independence you need? And you know, what I pick up from you is your independence, to me, appeared to have been harmed by the fact that suddenly, halfway through your appointment, the Home Secretary decided that she was going to publish the reports, not you. She was going to redact, not you, not seek your authority on that. And that, I think, undermined the strength of the independence that you thought you had when you took up the job.
Well, I was appointed by open selection, appointed by Sir David Norrington. There was no hearing in front of a select committee to affirm that appointment. So in that sense, answering the first part of your question, yes, I felt I was appointed to be very independent. I remember the advert for the job. The title of the advert was, "Can you withstand the public's harshest gaze?" That was the advert for the job. So it was a clear steer about what they wanted. They wanted somebody to look independent.
They wanted you to run for Parliament.
Well, they wanted somebody to look independently and report on the efficiency and effectiveness of borders immigration, and I think that's what we fulfilled. When it came to publication of reports, I think the legislation is slightly ambiguous. It can be read in a number of ways, and for 5 years we had an arrangement whereby I released my reports. Now, I had no difficulty with the Home Secretary laying reports before Parliament. The difficulty I anticipated, which I think came about, was that then constrains when reports can be released. Not least because Parliament, of course, sometimes isn't sitting for long periods when reports are completed. So that interpretation of the legislation, I think, endangers the perception of independence slightly. Now, if it's the legislation's fault and the legislation needs changing...
Well, my
Can I
understanding...
just stop you for a second? Because we have exactly the same situation with the Controller and Auditor General, Sir Amias Smalls, who is an officer of the House of Commons,
yes,
and who lays before Parliament National Audit Office reports. He's completely independent. His budget is determined by Parliament,
yep,
not by government. And it's true that National Audit Office reports can't be published unless Parliament is sitting. But that's never been a constraint of any seriousness. It's never been a matter of any moment or comment for anybody, because it's really just a few weeks in the summer, in August, and a couple of weeks at Christmas and a couple of weeks at Easter. It's not ever been a constraint. The issue is, to what extent do your independent, and I don't know whether to put inverted commas around it or not,
yes,
reports get tweaked, adjusted, altered, interfered with in any way, shape or form by others before they are published, after the moment when you thought you'd finished them. That's
right,
the issue. And do they?
No, that's not my experience. Now, the redaction is in the Act. Powers of redaction by the Home Secretary are in the Borders Act on grounds of national security, and that's a matter for the Home Secretary to take a judgment on. Quite clear about that. That's in the legislation.
But
when I was appointed, I knew
fetters
that.
your independence. Let me come back on two things.
But in terms of, if I could just answer Mr. Bacon's point, I've never felt that my reports have been altered or tweaked, as you put it. The reports go for factual accuracy checking only to the Home Office, in order to ensure that there is no mistake in fact in the reports. That's quite normal in an inspectorate regime. But I've never felt that my reports have been altered or changed, and I've never felt that I've had any pressure to do that.
Mr. Vaughan, I've got to come
and
back.
I've been very clear about that throughout my time as an inspector.
I've got to come back. I'd like one example. The NAO's got one, but one that I read, I can't remember if it was in the report or in some of the papers around it, where they deliberately redacted the number of illegal immigrants who were coming in, I think it was through Calais. And the actual, for some reason, and I think that is an issue of public interest and public concern, the number was redacted on the grounds that it somehow interfered with national security. And give your other example, if you can, Louise.
We were talking about at the juxtaposed controls report from 2013, which I think was at broadly the same time we were working on the border force. And I think there was an issue of your report at the time being redacted and us having very similar material in the NAO report and publishing that.
Yes.
So that just seems to me redactions. It may have been in the power. You may be right that legally it's in the power of the Home Secretary.
Yes.
But there were redactions, which both those examples seem to me, I can't for the life of me see how can they ever be justified in terms of national interest. And they reduced the strength and your independence. And just on the timing issue, to come back on Richard on that, if you look at our actual brief, one can understand a little bit of the timing, but a 163-day delay in reporting on an inspection of immigration enforcement activity in London West Midlands, the Operation Nexus,
yes,
can hardly be justified on the grounds that Parliament wasn't sitting. That was a deliberate delay to weaken the impact of your report.
Well, as I said in my letter to you, yes, I wasn't happy with that situation.
And what about the redactions?
Well, redactions were a matter for the Home Secretary if she took a view on national security. I mean, I don't know
you
what.
Can't say, how can that be national security? Sorry, I'm being. If there is an argument, we now know how many illegal migrants get over Calais. We now know what happens because we had it in our report, even if you didn't put it into your report.
Yes.
We now know what actually happens on the borders when they're short-staffed.
Yes.
So where on earth has that impacted on our national security, which we all care about passionately?
Yes, well, I don't disagree with the sentiment. I think redaction has to be used very, very sparingly. And the whole purpose of inspection reports is that they are transparent and open.
Anne wanted to come in, then Stephen.
It was actually on that point, but I got the sense that Mr. Sedwill was beginning to get a bit tense in relation to some of the answers that Mr. Vine had given, and I'm just wondering whether you would like the option to explain why I got that impression.
Not at all tense in the answers Mr. Vine was given. The Chair made a couple of assertions there that I would want to come back and challenge, and I can either do that now or later.
While you're thinking about that, could you also explain why it would take 163 days to publish a Chief Inspector's report and use Parliament as an excuse for not publishing earlier than 163 days?
I don't think we did use Parliament as an excuse in that case, and indeed that report, which was into Operation Nexus, was I think, largely positive report. So that's the assertion I wanted to challenge, that somehow we were seeking to lessen the impact of a report that was largely positive. We've been working through this in the last year. I've talked to the committee about this before. We've now agreed that they will all be published within 8 weeks. I don't think it was satisfactory to find ourselves in the situation that we did, where it was unpredictable about when we should publish. I remember talking to the committee about the options we were considering, whether there should be a fixed deadline, whether we should publish in batches, whether there was a way of doing it in a way that is predictable or not, and that is what we've now agreed. That particular report, I don't know why it took 163 days. When the Department of State is taking responsibility for actually putting anything out, of course, we get caught up into the general government management of when information is released, and I've found myself caught on that in other situations as well. For example, in releasing information relating to some of the child sex abuse file inquiries and so on, where we just got stuck on government procedures about release. That's why we needed to find a solution that guarantees a fixed period for publishing the Chief Inspector's report, so we don't have that question about whether we are, in some sense, managing the news.
Why should it even take 8 weeks to publish an independent report, unless there are particular issues, which we've already alluded to, that may impact on national security? If the report is independent, if the inspectorate is truly independent, then surely it should be within their jurisdiction to decide when to publish those reports. 8 weeks, I mean, there are some speed readers in the Home Office, I would imagine, that could go through a report much quicker than 8 weeks. And given the fact that it doesn't have to go through some of the cross-governmental issues that you've already identified, why should it take 8 weeks?
Well, most inspectorate reports do take about that time. I can't remember the exact numbers in the NEO report. But well, anyway, I mean,
4 weeks.
This is after this is by the way after the final report is agreed. All we do is, as John has said, is fact check. The report itself is signed off by him, and it's his report, subject only to the national security redactions potentially. We've agreed that it will be 8 weeks. There's a second question which you referred to, Ms Maguire, which is whether he should be publishing it himself, or whether his successor should publish it himself. That's essentially a matter of the Act. The Act does actually say the Secretary of State shall lay these before Parliament, and so that's in the Act. Of course, it's entirely up to Parliament to change the Act. Well, but that's our legal advice, Madam Chair, and that's why we took it. The Home Secretary set that out.
From John Vine's letter. I sought my own independent legal advice from Treasury solicitors who have concluded that the Home Office's interpretation of the legislation was neither the obvious nor the only interpretation of the law, and that my view was also valid.
Well, the Home Secretary, in the end, is the Secretary of State who has to lay these reports before Parliament. That's what the Act says. That's what our legal advice says. She set that out in a written ministerial statement last year.
Why do you treat the two of them so differently?
Well, we don't. We're implementing.
Sir Thomas Winsor can publish all his reports when he likes. If anything's redacted, he redacts. If you decide to redact anything, he has to approve it. It's completely different.
It is, but sorry, the point I'm challenging, Madam Chair, is not that I decide to do that. That's what the legislation says. The legislation was passed at various different periods. The legislation, the Borders Act of 2007, that established the Independent Chief Inspector of Immigration, says both of those things. The Secretary of State shall lay and the Secretary of State shall redact on national security grounds. It's different for the Chief Inspector of Constabulary. So we're just applying the legislation. It's not a choice. I have to. We're just applying it.
The real issue is why the legislation was framed in that way, and one can only surmise that, looking at it, people said, my goodness, we don't want to go down the road of having that and somebody as independent as the Inspector of Constabulary. God, what a mistake that was. Let's dial it down a bit. I mean, that's what happened, isn't it?
Well, I think, Mr. Bacon, I think Mr. Vine's already answered that in the sense that this was a new inspectorate created at that time. It's not really for me to answer for what was put into the legislation, but it was the creation of a whole new inspectorate into an area of public policy that had never been inspected. So I think, to be fair to the drafters of the legislation, they were advancing the cause of inspection at that time.
In this small question, you'd been proceeding on the basis that you'd understood the legislation differently for some time. And that, what was it that caused the change of mind that led to the legal advice being taken?
I can't recall.
I don't quite follow why that was suddenly... It was all right for a few years and then it wasn't all right.
I can't recall the event. I seem to recall, actually, there was a hearing with this committee at which actually the reverse question came up. You asked why we had published, why I had published one of the Chief Inspector's reports.
No, I think we asked why you delayed in publishing.
Exactly, and this was during the period when actually we didn't have any, we didn't apply any Home Office intervention in the publication of the reports. It was during the period when they were entirely within the gift of the Chief Inspector. And I remember we had to clarify that point, and I think it was probably prompted by that, but I can't recall exactly.
I'm not sure that's quite the answer of the question. Why did you suddenly decide that what had been acceptable, effectively, for some number of years was no longer acceptable, and we then had these inordinate delays where it appears that parliamentary days or parliamentary time off was being used as an excuse? What actually happened?
I don't want to overplay the parliamentary calendar. Mr. Bacon's point is absolutely right about that. I mean, that might affect things by a week or a couple of weeks here and there, but it doesn't affect the overall period of the report. And I'm not going to defend.
We'll bank that one then, and we'll hold you to 8 weeks.
You can hold us to 8 weeks.
Oh, that's good.
No, you can hold it. That is what we've set out. Set out by the Home Secretary in a written ministerial statement. That is our interpretation of the legislation. The Parliament may change the legislation, they may change the terms of the Chief Inspector, but that's our interpretation of the legislation.
Mr. Vine, do you think 8 weeks is okay? Is it enough? I mean, is it short enough?
My view has always been the report should come out as soon as practicable.
Yes, you said
And
in your,
I was happy with the arrangement that was in place, which would
you mean
work
the one
for
where it was
5
in
years.
your gift, basically?
Well, it would work for 5 years with
Yes.
everybody's agreement.
It's turned out that suddenly the Home Office woke up and said, whoops, it's unlawful, which apparently it hadn't been before.
But I can understand.
the point I wanted to just
I can
press you on-
understand if it is unlawful.
Well, if it is, but as you say, there's legal advice saying that interpretation is not at all obvious. But your letter to us said, the majority of my reports since January 2014 have been subject to significant delays between submission to the Home Secretary and being laid in Parliament. I consider that lengthy delays in publishing reports risk reducing the effectiveness of independent inspection, which depends to a large extent on timely publication of findings, and it is contributing to a sense that the independence of my role is being compromised. These are quite strong words. What I'm really asking is 8 weeks, as soon as practicable, is as long as a piece of string, is 8 weeks acceptable, or would you prefer a shorter period? If you could choose the length of time, what would you choose?
Well, I think 8 weeks is a reasonable period, but I mean, when we were publishing under the old regime, we sent the reports for 2 weeks reading to the Home Secretary, and then we tended to publish after the following 2 weeks. So that was still a shorter period than is proposed, but I think...
Do you mean 4 weeks in total?
Yes, 4 weeks generally in total. Now, there would have been some minor alterations to that. That was a general rule. Because, of course, inspection reports are based on evidence which degrades after time.
4 weeks would be long enough, wouldn't it, Mr. Sedwill, if you wanted to be effective?
I don't think there's a specific period, and we've said 8 weeks is the limit. It's not that it will be 7 weeks and 6 days that we do them all. We've just said that we will guarantee, that's what I can't remember the exact word in the WMS, but that we will publish within 8 weeks. I think as soon as practicable is entirely sensible.
Have you done, Steve wants to come in. Can I just, one more on this? Have you done any work on trying to ensure that the two inspectorates are aligned in their approach? I mean, it's all very well telling us your job, Home Office, more than anybody else, produces legislation ad nauseum. You could have very easily produced a little clause in one of your annual bills saying we're going to treat the Inspector of Immigration in the same way as we treat the Inspector of Police.
Not that I'm aware of. And their jobs are...
Why not?
Well, their jobs are somewhat different. Well, one is inspecting what is now part of the department, and which, even when it was an agency, was exercising functions directly on behalf of ministers. The Secretary of State is actually in law the person who makes immigration decisions, and officials make those decisions on her behalf. And the police are constitutionally independent. There are 43
Why does that change
forces.
the nature? I mean, I think one of the general things we're going to pull out is that shouldn't change the nature of the inspection role on a public service. Whoever, okay, one goes to the Home Secretary, the other one goes to crime commissioners. That shouldn't make any difference about how we inspect.
But I'm not really arguing with Madam Chair. You just asked me whether we've done it. The answer is we haven't. Legislation comes forward at different times, usually in a different political context. Quite often, oversight arrangements of various kinds, as we've found in other areas, are part of the parliamentary debate and often part of a debate between the two houses. And so legislation, I mean, it's a more organic process than that. It isn't that we've codified all the legislation or focused on this as a particular priority. The two inspectorates do an effective job for us and for the public. It hasn't really registered as a priority to align the way they work.
I just have to, as a comment, I'm going to bring in Stephen. I don't think you'd find around this committee any disagreement about the role of inspection. Interesting. I don't think it's a partisan issue.
I'm not suggesting it is.
Stephen.
I just wanted to come back really to where we started out to try and get an answer to the questions that I think we were asking, which weren't just to Mr. Vine, but they were to Mr. Hardwick and Sir Thomas as well. And could I just ask, I'll start with you, Mr. Vine. Your appointment is signed off by, or the appointment of the position that you formerly held is signed off by the Home Secretary, is that right?
That's correct.
And is that true for you as well, Mr. Hardwick, and true for you, Sir Thomas? It's actually the Home Secretary who signs off the appointments. Or sorry, the Secretary of State.
It's I think actually in my case it's the Queen on the advice of the Prime Minister or on the advice of the Justice Secretary.
Right,
I think
but it's effectively the Justice Secretary who has a veto or the Home Secretary who has a veto. So I think my question to all three of you is twofold. Firstly, given that is the case, how on earth can you possibly be seen to be independent of the departments which you are effectively supposed to be inspecting? And secondly, wouldn't it be much, much more sensible if those appointments were made by Parliament and that you reported to Parliament in the same way that the Auditor General does, rather than reporting to the department? And that would be surely a much stronger regime of independent inspection. I can see the horror on the faces of the two permanent secretaries in front of us, but let's leave that to one side. Surely you would agree that that would be a much stronger inspection regime than this ridiculous system where you're not really independent of the department at all, or certainly you can't be seen to be independent because you're appointed by the Secretary of State for the very departments you're inspecting.
Let's go to Nick Hardwick first, and then go to Tom Winsor, and then come back to you, John Vine, just so everybody has a chance to say how they're saying.
Well, I agree. In answer to your original question, Chair, is my inspectorate independent enough? My answer would be no. That's partly because of the budget issues. In the end, the department that is responsible for the bodies I inspect also sets my budget. I feel my budget is pretty much constantly under review. So while I am, on the one hand, perhaps making some pretty robust statements about prisons and other places I'm inspecting, I know they're looking at my budget at the same time. I have to say, I have no complaint about the way I've actually been treated or the way in which Dame Ursula and her colleagues actually deal with this. They've been very helpful. But that possibility clearly exists.
It doesn't mean that your budget has been changed or cut down because...
I don't believe my budget...
To influence you?
It's never been cut down to influence me, but clearly that possibility exists, right? Or the threat of it exists. On the question of appointment, as the Chair said in introduction, I decided I wasn't going to go through a public sort of reappointment process because I felt I'd be very clear about the need for the inspectorate to be independent, and I felt it just wouldn't be credible if during a lengthy public appointment process, on the one hand I was expected to be speak with candour about what I was finding when I inspected, which I know sometimes is unwelcome to ministers and officials, while at the same time I'm asking those same ministers and officials to give me a job. And I decided I didn't think that would be credible.
Would you agree it creates a clear conflict of interest during the appointment procedure?
If that is not a conflict of interest, I don't know what is.
And the fact that also, would you agree that the fact that you're dependent upon the Secretary of State for your budget also creates a clear conflict of interest?
I don't think that's right. My view, as I've said publicly before, I agree with the recommendations of the Public Administration Select Committee that certainly in the case of my inspectorate, we should not be accountable to the department who's responsible for the bodies we inspect. We should be accountable to some other mechanism. It might be something like the Justice Committee, it could be the Cabinet Office, but not the Minister of Justice. And if I could just make just two points. One is I don't want that to be interpreted as a criticism of any of the officials I've worked with. Far from it. They've been very helpful and I appreciate that. And secondly, I wouldn't want to, it's been a privilege to do the job. I'm not talking in my own interest. If my time's come to an end, I'm sorry about that, but so be it. But I think for the future, it is very important that particularly with closed institutions that people can't see of their own accord, you have an independent body that can describe candidly what we're seeing. And I think the overall structures risk inhibiting that. The Public Administration Select Committee, I know, talked about the politicisation of the appointments process. I think there is a danger of that, and in the end, I don't think that's in anybody's interest that we do that.
And what about reporting? Because our idea that you should report to Parliament rather than to... Reports
are published on entirely on my authority. I've never had any, we fact check in a normal way, but they are published as quickly as I can read them. If there's any delays, I look at them all. I look at every single one.
And you're happy with the current mechanism?
The current mechanism is fine.
So
but
it's not different from the John Vine?
But my worryings, I would say, is I think it does need to be looked at because, my legislation pretty much says report on the treatment of prisoners and the conditions in prison, that's it, right? There's no safeguards in it. So how we work is, I think, on the whole custom and practice rather than there are no statutory or regulatory safeguards. and there may be an argument for putting some of those into place. If
And
the
just for
system is
clarity,
looked up.
does the Home Secretary not sign off your reports at all?
No, neither the Home Secretary nor the Justice Secretary. I would say what they do sign off, certainly in terms of the Home Office, is they sign off the responses to our reports, and I think they do that with some care, and I'm grateful for it. So, but they don't sign off the reports themselves.
Just for clarity, could you tell the committee what date is the legislative basis for your role? Just if you don't have it,
It's the 1981 Criminal Justice Act as amended by the 2006 Immigration, Asylum and Nationality Act, and the 2006 Criminal Justice and Policing Act, and the 2011...
Yeah, I didn't need all that detail. 1981 so it's about 40 years. It's interesting.
Could we come to Sir Thomas and maybe ask all of the same questions, if you don't mind?
Thank you. The questions about independence. There are two aspects to independence, and both of them have to be satisfied. Legal independence, what does the statute say? And behavioural independence, how do you actually behave in practice? There's no question that the Inspectorate of Constabulary is independent of the police, independent of the government, subject to the qualifications I'll give you, independent of police and crime commissioners, independent of everyone. None of those can interfere in any way with the content of our reports.
But they could try and influence them by saying, as you came to the end of your tenure, or certainly a Home Secretary could, one could foresee circumstances where a Home Secretary could effectively communicate to you, I'm sure not in writing, if you want to be reappointed, I don't want a critical report on such and such a constabulary. Yeah, and that makes your independence, whilst no doubt at the moment you do everything you can to be independent, and are shown that makes your independence illusory in the eyes of the public, and that's not desirable.
In this room 13 years ago, I was asked the same kind of question, and I said...
Forgive me, I was very young at that point and not in the House.
So was I. I was rail regulator at the time, an independent rail regulator. And I said that I did not wish to be reappointed after my 5-year term. I was only 2.5 years into it. Had expired. I think that made me stronger, undoubtedly. But... nevertheless, the process of appointment is the appointment by the Secretary of State, and then it's approved by the Prime Minister, and then it goes for royal appointment. I have the advantage that nobody could question my political impartiality, because I was appointed as rail regulator by John Prescott and as Chief Inspector of Constabulary by Theresa May. So I have the advantage of that. And when she appointed me, she could not have doubted my attitude to independence, because particularly during the collapse of Railtrack in 2001 and then the financial settlements that I gave the railway industry in 2003, I went through the fires of hell on independence. I was threatened with emergency primary legislation.
I don't want to stop
take me under
Sir Thomas, but you're tilting at windmills. No one is questioning your independence.
No, I understand.
I'm much more interested in the theoretical question of whether the office is independent.
I get that. Thank you. And the analogy with judges, I think, is a relevant one. The most senior judges have to have their appointments signed off by the Lord Chancellor and the Prime Minister. They are political animals. But hold on, they're appointed by the Judicial Appointments Commission, and there's no way that the Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice is going to say, I'm not appointing X as a High Court judge. Well, they do have that right, actually. The Judicial Appointments Commission comes first, and therefore there is a check and balance, and this is, I think, a legitimate model for consideration by the committee. There is a check and balance in there. The Judicial Appointments Commission will go through a very thorough process, and there are no political criteria in how they go about their job. In 2004, the House of Lords Committee, one of the House of Lords Committees, I think made a recommendation that economic regulators, and you could extend this to inspectorates, should have a similar process. And indeed, you could go further and say that rather than have pre-appointment hearings by parliamentary committees, they could be given vetoes. I wouldn't personally be in favour of that. Our accountability, though, is not just to ministers. Indeed, it is principally to the public, to Parliament, to the media, to the service that we inspect, and the best protection against interference with your independence is just to do a really good job. As far as what we do is concerned, it is the case that under the Police Reform Social Responsibility Act 2011, the Home Secretary has the duty or the function of approving our inspection programme. Now, that is a legislative change, because under the Police Act 1996, HMIC only had to consult the Home Secretary on the inspection programme for the year. Now we have to obtain their approval, and I thought that was rather puzzling. But nevertheless, in practice, it has not been a difficulty, because everything we've been proposed, the Home Secretary has said, yes, we want you to do that, and we'd like you to do quite a lot more as well. I think the main constraint on independence, if it were exercised, is the control over the budget. But this is public money. Now, it could, I suppose, be a budgetary control given to Parliament instead of to the Secretary of State. But I think the principle means, I've no real complaint about that. I've just had a 66% increase.
You've had a 66% increase. The rest of them have had a bit of a cut.
More than a 66% increase in workload, then I would say.
Well, yeah, but you've had a 66%, you know,
That's true.
You're sitting, in fact, one of the interesting things is why on earth that got an increase.
Let's just say where we were. I think you said the greatest threat to independence is the control that the department has over the budget.
It is a potential threat because, in my experience, it's never been a difficulty.
So one thing you would agree with then is it would be sensible to take the setting of the budgets away from ministers.
Well, that would be one way of doing it, but somebody's got to take the decision, and in the end of the day it's going to be politicians, whether it's politicians in the executive government or politicians in Parliament. But yes, it would put the thing at greater distance, because the Home Secretary is responsible for the police, and the lion's share of the Home Office budget is spent on the police. But we've got to get realpolitik into this as well. The police spend £13 billion a year of public money, and my inspectorate spends £22 million checking how efficiently and effectively that £13 billion is spent. Now, if a future Home Secretary were to say, I want to clip your wings or amputate your wings, we don't want inspection of that £13 billion anymore, we're going to cut your budget in half. Then effectively what they would be saying is we want to close our eyes to a material part of the efficiency and effectiveness of the spending of £13 billion. And politically, that might be very difficult to do. It's not impossible, but it would be quite difficult to do. And I think that that is a relevant factor as well.
Right. Mr. Vine, do you want to come in at the end on the specific questions that I was asking Mr. Hardwick and Sir Tom?
Well, I think it's an interesting theory, actually, because uniquely, as has been pointed out in the NAO report, I inspect a government department. When the post was established, of course, there was an agency there. That agency developed and morphed and changed. Largely it changed and was de-agencyfied because of some of the work that I did. And so, in the past, when a contentious report, say, reached the media, who would be the chief executive of the agency that responded to me, it wasn't the department. And for the last couple of years, of course, it's a minister, because now the interface is direct with the department. So I think that changes slightly the climate in which I operate.
Okay.
Related, in respect of comparing us with other inspectorates. So, not that, as I've said before in this hearing, I don't feel as though I've had anything other than a constructive relationship with the Home Office, but it's been one at a distance, and one which I think has ensured that I'm able to report independently anything I want. I mean, like Sir Thomas mentioned, I've put a plan to the Home Secretary to my legislation says I have to consult the Home Secretary. She doesn't approve the plan. I've worked for 3 Home Secretaries. None of them have made any differences to the proposals I've put forward. My appointment was made overseen by the Civil Service Commission. So there's been lots of safeguards in place, but before I retired, I was reporting directly on a government department.
And you'd agree with me that you'd be seen, certainly by the public, to be much more independent, and you would feel much more independent if you were reporting to Parliament.
Well, I think your independence is established by what you actually do at the end of the day. I don't think anybody would argue that this inspectorate has had a tremendous impact.
The trouble is we never know what's going on behind the scenes as members of the public, or indeed as members of this House, do we?
Well, I think the public needs to have confidence that they believe an inspectorate is acting independently.
Do you
Could
think...
I
ask a supplementary to Mr Phillips, actually? If you
Mr.
don't mind?
Vine, yeah.
It was to Mr Vine. I really want to know if you used the phrase changes the climate. Do you think that the change of climate that you've described adds weight to Mr Phillips's argument about the importance of setting the budget perhaps in a different way? Is there a corresponding increase in the power of Mr Phillips's argument about doing the budget in a different way, perhaps through a parliamentary commission, because of the change of climate?
I would say there is weight, yes.
Thank you.
Can I ask one
Sorry,
other question?
Margaret, may I just finish on this? I just wanted to go to Sir Humphrey in the form of Mr Sedwill and Dame Ursula, and to ask them why it's a bad idea that independent, supposedly independent inspectorates, which are inspecting departments run by ministers, why is it a bad idea that, in fact, those independent inspectors should be run independently by Parliament rather than by the departments? Why is it a bad idea?
Shall I
Come on, give us the best Sir Humphrey reason as to why it's terrible.
I think probably there's a couple of things to say, of which the most important from the perspective of the department is what is working practically. At present, it is our perception as a department that Nick Hardwick is a completely independent inspector of prisons. All the inspectors are going to have to get their money from somewhere. Virtually every arm's length body of the Ministry of Justice has a conversation at some point that says, couldn't we deal direct with the Cabinet Office, usually because they think somehow more money would be forthcoming that way. I think there is a practical question about whether a discussion that was held differently would result in a different amount of money, where I think realistically it wouldn't. I think the point that you're discussing, therefore, is one of perception rather than the practical amount of money that would be in question. We've been doing a lot of work in the Ministry of Justice about the way we sponsor these arm's-length bodies to seek to be really clear about what the role of the sponsors are. And we think that at the moment this works in a way that enables the inspector to be able to make his report independently. As it happens, we have reduced budgets in the Ministry of Justice. We've reduced the inspector's budget by a lot less than we've reduced the main budget of the department, because we thought that it was tremendously important.
You're coming
to
here
carry
from the
on
Ministry of Justice. Isn't Nemo
independence.
Judex in causa sua? No one should be a judge in his own case, the maxim by which you should live as well as everybody else, Dame Ursula.
There's just one other point that I was going to make, and I see that Nick would like to respond as well, which is, at bottom, what is the most valuable thing about the inspections of prisons is that something practical happens as a result of those inspections. And one of the things that inspectorates and the bodies that they inspect always have to cope with is the balance between sufficient independence to be able to be fearless in what you say about the service that you're inspecting, and a sufficient understanding of the service that you're inspecting that actually what you say will land and people will do something about it.
I think
that requires, it seems to me, some kind of linkage between the inspectorate
that sounds
and the department.
No, we want to come to impact. We'll come
And there's, because Dame Ursula is talking about impact.
we don't want yet. Let's stick to the appointment process
Okay,
and then come
okay,
to
okay.
impact. Because I think it's a different issue.
Well, just to say 2 points. Of course, in my case, I inspect bodies that are report to a number of different departments. So I inspect immigration detention as well as prisons. I don't think there's a problem with my relationship. It doesn't. The fact I'm not sponsored by the Home Office doesn't affect the impact of my inspections of immigration detention. So I don't think that link is necessary to have impact. The other point I say, when credibility is called into question, ironically, is not when I'm being critical of an establishment, because people get that's independent. It's when I'm actually saying this place has really improved, or this place is doing well. Then that's when they say, oh, well, you're part of the department. You would be saying that, wouldn't you? Right? So actually, I think it would do the department favours if we weren't linked to them, not because we would then be more critical. It's that actually the times we were being positive, actually people wouldn't necessarily be so suspicious of. And you would make the relationships with the department work, whether you had a direct sponsorship.
I want to talk about two more issues on appointment and then move to impact, because I think that's the other big thing. The one on appointment is, we've heard a lot. Nick Hardwick said he's not going to reapply because he thinks that will undermine his independence during the application process.
That's correct.
Okay. Why, Mr. Sedwill, are you appointing John Vine's successor for a short a period as 2 years?
Well, I think it's partly to do with where we are in the cycle. So when my predecessors appointed John, he was appointed for 3 years and has had two 2-year extensions, I think. Sir Tom was appointed for 3 years and has been given a 5-year extension, although we moved the start date to fit with the new parliamentary cycle. With the appointment of John's successor, David Bolt, that appointment's come essentially within 3 months, 3-4 months of the election. We didn't have the results yet of the NEO report, and we didn't know how far-reaching the NEO report, or indeed this inquiry, might go in terms of the structure of inspectorates. So it seemed prudent just to go for a relatively short appointment. And it's also, one has to be, there are rules, but there's also the spirit of public appointments. It's a controversial area. It's quite close to the end of the Parliament. I would expect if, on the assumption there is no structural change, that, as in the other cases, if David Bolt wants to continue...
I mean, I love the obsequious idea that you so listen to our recommendations. We wish this was true. I just think... Yeah, go on.
So just to say, my successor is only being appointed for 3 years, as opposed to 5
years. Well, I just think that's
the worst of all possibilities. You'll have 3, it'll take you a year or so to get up to speed. Then you are either not going to want to apply in my case, or you'll be looking over your shoulder saying, is the Secretary of State crossing me? It's a really bad mistake.
Absolutely.
I mean, it seems to me what you're saying is that if you get someone in for too long, they become too powerful, a counterbalance to the Home Office. I have to say, can I just say that I flattered the committee and the National Audit Office is that the idea that this inquiry could be so far-ranging that the Home Office is going to change its juggernaut approach for appointment of an inspector seems to me extraordinary, because I don't think that, I have to say, with due respect, I'm not sure that departments generally change their behaviour in that way before we issue our findings.
Well, I have to say, there's a series of assertions being made in this hearing which I do have to challenge.
First,
the assertion that inspectors become too powerful and challenge the department. John was appointed for 3 years. Within that 3 years had already established a very strong profile for himself. And his inspectorate, and was reappointed.
Decided not to go for the appointment, because partly, maybe putting words in his mouth, partly because you're falling back the power.
Well, may I finish the point? Was reappointed twice, and has served under three Home Secretaries. We've just reappointed Tom Winsor about 6 months ago, which will take him through most of the next Parliament. And I think we just have to get a little bit away from the Westminster conversation. What matters is the point that you were just referring to, which is the impact. When there is a report that is relatively positive, it gets no attention whatsoever. When there is a critical report, particularly in the immigration system, we have UQs, parliamentary hearings, the word chaos all over the headlines, and John finds himself invited onto the Today,
which is why you appoint for 2 or 3 years, because you don't want you want to give them a road test, really, to see whether they're going to be too difficult to work with.
No, that's just not true. And Mr. Vine established a very
strong... So why were you appointing for 5 years previously, and now you're appointing for 2 or 3?
We didn't, Mr. Phillips. We appointed for 3 and had 2 2-year extensions. So, I'm sorry. The facts are just different to what I was just setting out.
Timescale. Sir Tom Winsor, you said, was appointed 6 months ago for on a contract of 5 years.
That's about right.
6 months ago, you did know that the general election was going to be in May 2015. But you've said that one of the reasons why you have appointed John Vine's successor is because it's at the end of a Parliament. When is Nick Hardwick's appointment going to be made?
I don't know when it'll be made. It'll be made, I think, the current schedule is before the end of March.
So before the end of March, and it's for 3 years. Is that right?
Yeah, and it'll start in July for 3 years.
Right. But so that comes at the tail end of a Parliament. So I suppose what I'm asking you is why we have gone from 5 years, which is acceptable, and I have no problem with that, 6 months before the end of 7 months before the end of a Parliament, to a reason why you couldn't appoint for more than 2 years because it was close to a Parliament, And Nick Hardwick has just said that his appointment is for 3 years at the tail end of a Parliament. There's an inconsistency in your justification there for short-term appointments, frankly.
These things are a matter of judgment, isn't it? Right? But there is a standard.
Yeah, and that's why I'm.
Well, hang on.
Well, that's why I'm questioning. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Sedwill, if you find this tedious.
I'm sorry. I'd like to finish the sentence, if I may.
Right. Well,
there is a convention that public appointments. There is a 6-month convention around a general election around public appointments. Mr. Windsor's appointment was made before that. Mr. Vine's successor's appointment is being made within it.
So, Mr. Vine, no, his successor has been appointed for 2 years. Is that correct?
That's right.
So, why is Nick Hardwick's been appointed for 3 years?
The question about how long to appoint inspectors for relates partly to the length of time, to whether you choose to say there's a long first appointment, which at the end of which somebody may or may not choose to reapply. Because one of the things to bear in mind is that the Office for of the Commissioner of Public Appointments has issued guidance in the last year or so to say that they would expect people to reapply at the end of their appointments and not for people to be reappointed to public appointments. So there is a tension between a desire to ensure that people are not continuously reappointed in public appointments and this tension about inspectors. So that's one question. The second point is the extent to which people wish to apply for roles for longer periods. One of the questions that arose for us in relation with our difficulties around the probation inspector was that we first advertised it for 5 years, and the advice we got when we went out to see who we could get as an inspector was that actually lots of people didn't want to tie themselves for that long to an initial appointment. So that was the reason we changed that appointment to 3 years, and it's the reason why we've changed in the case of the prisoners appointment.
Resign, presumably, during the 5 years?
They can, but people generally don't want to take up an appointment with a plan of resigning before the end of their appointment.
Not the best set of arguments. I think it would be just easier if you'd said to us it was a political decision. Because in a way that's fine, you know, we may disagree with it, but it's fine. It just seems just daft. Can I ask you, Dame Ursula, this is, I think, the final issue, unless others have got, around appointments, and I want to, may not surprise you, talk to you about Paul McDowell.
Certainly.
In fact, out of the 5 inspectorates we're looking at, only 1 will be in post, won't they? I mean, you're losing 4 out of the 5, so a bit carelessness around this. Now, Paul McDowell, his wife was what was she? She was, I'm going to get this right because I know what she was Deputy Managing Director of Sedexo. And she's now become Managing Director, as I understand, recently of Sedexo.
Of the Justice.
Sedexo has got 6 of the probation contracts.
Correct.
And Sedexo is working with NACRO, which Paul McDowell was Chief Executive of before he became the Inspector.
That's right.
Now, all of that is very worrying potential conflicts of interest. Can I ask when you first knew about the links between Paul McDowell and Sedexo?
I think the process with Paul McDowell started with when he would have been selected for interview in August 2013. And I think I was probably told at the time that one of the candidates was, because he has been completely transparent with us about this from the start, about his relationship, that his wife worked for a company which would be interested in justice business. So I think probably when the interviews were held, the question that he was related to someone in that company, I'm pretty sure someone mentioned that to me at the time, and we took legal advice about, because this was an Office for Commissioner of Public Appointments appointment, we took legal advice about the position of Paul McDowell when we interviewed him, should it be the case that he got the job. And it was clear that he was chief executive of NACRO. It was clear that he would have to sever his connections. Obviously, he would cease to be chief executive of NACRO. And at the time when he was interviewed and then when he was appointed, we hadn't actually reached the stage of companies qualifying for bidding for the transforming rehabilitation service.
But you had the policy decision.
Sorry?
You had the policy direction was agreed. You knew you were going to go for...
We knew. We were.
You were on the policy.
We were absolutely on that path.
You were implementing the policy.
We absolutely were, and we took advice about what we should do in relation to a person whose wife worked for a company which might conceivably be and was likely to be bidding for this work. At that point, bear in mind, we didn't know whether they would qualify in the first place, the company, and then whether they would be successful as a preferred bidder, and then how many contracts they would win. So there was about a 12-month process between us appointing Paul McDowell when his wife was working in a deputy role in a company that was bidding for business, and the point at which came at around the same time, he had been in post for about 12 months. It became clear that the process of the competition led to Sodexo winning a significant number of contracts, 6, and his wife got promoted. At that point, he then was really clear that the arrangements we'd put in place when he was appointed, in case there were a conflict of interest, wouldn't work with such a significant conflict of interest, and that's why he has terminated his employment.
What?
But the period when we were appointing him, it would have been, we took legal advice and we concluded it would have been improper to exclude him on the basis that his wife's company might conceivably qualify for work, and if they did qualify, that they might win some work, because we looked at arrangements we could put in place so that he would not be involved in inspecting if they did get some work.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, let's take it step by step. One assumes, therefore, the Justice Secretary knew as well.
The Justice Secretary, he certainly was involved in the appointment, so he would have known, yes.
Why did you not tell the Justice Select Committee, that is the committee that is authorised to, what's the term?
There was a pre-appointment hearing.
The pre-appointment
and there was a
hearing.
protocol that the Cabinet Office drew up, which said this is the information you should supply to select committees for pre-appointment hearings. We'd never actually given conflict of interest information to...
Why not?
We simply followed the protocol and we didn't supply it. And the protocol was amended not long after that to say...
It was in Coriolanus, wasn't it? Proceed by the procedure. I mean, isn't it obvious if there's something so stark, even if accepting what you've said, and I do accept what you've said, that it would have been improper in the circumstances until, etc. Isn't it obvious that that kind of stark fact is one that you would see, stare you in the face, that that's a fact that you should disclose? Isn't it?
No, as I said, we actually looked at the delicate handling of the arrangements for the competition, where the bidders for the competition and the competition bid was being handled in a way that anybody who was outside managing that was not involved with what was going on. Our legal advice suggested that it was very important to avoid any suggestion that we were implying something about what might happen in relation to Sodexo if we mentioned that. As I said, in general, we had not covered conflicts of interest. We simply just went by, this is the information we supply to the Select Committee. And as soon as it became apparent that the arrangements we put in place were not going to be sustainable because of the size of the scale of the business that they'd won, and because his wife had been promoted, so 2 events happened that caused that change, we immediately notified.
But you knew Sodexo was a big player for justice services. You knew that. We knew that. Everybody knew that.
We did indeed, but
to be honest, to put you back into the context, you were desperately at that time looking around for anybody but G4S and Serco, given what they had done on the tagging contract. So that was it was absolutely obvious to all of us sitting here when we talked about you early on that Sodexo was going to pick up a substantial amount of this business.
Well, or might do, and
yes.
There was a strong likelihood that it would.
There was absolutely a possibility that they would win some work, and Paul McDowell was completely transparent about his wife's arrangements. And
except to the Justice Select Committee.
Except to the Justice, but that was not his. That was not his. I just want to be really clear. He's acted.
He could have volunteered the information.
He could, but the arrangement under which we supplied information to the Justice Select Committee was simply following the protocol. I think. I would just like to say that he is.
Was the protocol exclusive, Dame Ursula, or did it say this is the minimum set of information that you must provide when there is a pre-appointment scrutiny?
It simply said this is the information to give to the Cabinet Office.
But Dame Ursula
said, and that's what we did. I think there was no further consideration about it. It was simply this is what we do. We always give a standard set of information which does not uncover conflicts of interest. That's what we did in this case.
We come at it from a particular perspective because we have to declare all our interests. But I've been the other side of the table with a husband who's working and have to declare interests. So, these things, that you can get conflicts. But if it was such a big potential conflict, I would have thought it would have been just the obvious thing to declare. And it is quite common to go to committees, realise it's not, the old protocols haven't worked so well, and just declare because it seems the right thing to do, the sensible thing to do, to get it out there. And so it's not hidden. Sunlight is a great disinfectant. There's nothing to hide, then why not talk about it? That's what I'm puzzled about.
I think the thing to bear in mind is the competition process, the process of transforming rehabilitation was a lengthy process. The interviews were held
but his wife was working always for this big company in quite a senior role.
What she was working on at that time was bidding for business. What she was going to be doing as a role in Sodexo was not clear what she would be doing.
To be honest, she was deputy, and then she steps up to managing. It's not that big a jump. Deputy is pretty important. And what he said, Paul McDowell, is my wife and I do not discuss issues which it's inappropriate. For us to discuss. Now, if that's the case, if there's a real Chinese wall in their in all their relationship, all the more important for this to be out in the open.
Yes, exactly.
All the more important.
It happens in what the world.
Can I just ask you? You obviously disagree with that, don't you? You disagree with that.
I disagree because, as I say, the process at which all of this was taking place for those 12 months was before anybody awarded a contract to anybody. As soon as the contracts were awarded to Sodexo, immediately Paul McDowell himself said, "This is not tenable." The fact that they won the contracts and his wife's promotion happened within a few months of each other, and he immediately said we had put in place arrangements to say he would exclude himself from inspecting Sodexo if it were the case that they had won a contract under business. As soon as it became apparent, all the while until then, it wasn't a conflict of interest. It was a potential conflict.
I think, Meg, this will help you, and then you can come back. He was also responsible. He produced a report on the probation services,
yes,
which was to inform the Secretary of State's decision on decision making on the share sale for the privatisation, and he produced that report on how the probation service was to be privatised, from which his wife's own company stood if they would win the contract to make hundreds of millions of pounds. That wasn't so. He didn't stand back from that. He actually provided the advice to the Secretary of State with nobody apart from you.
In other words, there was a clear conflict of interest already present, Dame Ursula.
At the time when he was advising us on the state of probation and the readiness of the state of probation. The company that his wife was working for had not won any contracts at the time.
Was that a document that you published, that report on the state of probation services, or was it a document that was used internally by the Secretary of State in order to inform how the contracts would be let?
That report was published. It was published. Yeah.
You didn't finish the previous sentence. When you said readiness, you mean the readiness of the probation service to have contractors? Is that what you're going to say?
Well, not to have contractors. It was actually about the split between the National Probation Service and the 21 community rehabilitation
from which his wife stood and indeed has proven to have benefited.
And he made a number of
the way that they decided, therefore, to privatise, that makes it even worse, having heard that. The way they decided to privatise, a privatisation from which his wife stood and subsequently did benefit, was decided on advice from him, despite that potential conflict of interest.
It wasn't decided on advice from.
Well, that advice was prepared in order to inform the decision.
It was one of many pieces of evidence that was produced.
Do you regret anything about this episode?
Sorry?
Do you regret anything about this episode?
I regret that the net result has been that he spent a year doing work and producing work, some very good work also on the inspection of youth custody. I regret the fact that it's resulted in a person who would have been a really great probation inspector having to terminate, because now that we have the contracts in place, it would be inappropriate.
You don't think there was anything wrong?
I don't think that the process that we went through was wrong. No.
Do you think there was anything wrong with any of the conflict of interest right the way through?
I think
you stand by that. I mean, I'm shocked if you're saying that. I can understand we made a mistake, we got it wrong. I can get that. That's what happens in life. But to say that actually allowing him to hold that position right until February the 2nd of this year, when he finally resigned, that was.
I think that
I can't see how you can see that's right.
I think that the protocol as it stands at present, whereby we would reveal that conflict of information earlier to the select committee at a pre-appointment hearing, is helpful, and on future occasions that would be a useful thing to do. But we were abiding by the regime that we had in place at the time.
I think this would if you stopped an average person on the streets in Hackney and explained that, fair enough, two people with high-profile careers in a sector want to have good jobs, but surely the problem was that he had he wanted this high-level job while his wife had a high-level job in a potentially conflicting area, was always going to be a problem. And it seems to me that from what you've said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the department took legal advice to make sure it wasn't too hard on the guy, rather than looking at what were the best outcome in terms of transparency, openness and effectiveness was. So his rights to apply for a job, which really, if he had any sense, shouldn't have applied for in the first place, I'm sure it was a great promotion, a great job for him and everything, maybe he was very, very good at it, and I don't doubt what you say. But there's conflict of interest. I mean, it happens to a lot of people in public life where they've got conflicts, where you just have to address that beforehand and decide you're not going to apply for certain things because there will be a conflict. So would you do anything differently next time? Have you changed any of the rules? Perhaps Mark Sedwill could answer this as well. Anything happened across government so that when someone declares that level of interest, there isn't some sort of conversation that says this is really not going to work, at the very least, and maybe something more substantial if those gentle chats don't deliver?
Two things. As I said, I think the change in the protocol where those conflicts of interest would be surfaced publicly through the pre-appointment hearing is a good change.
It was a good change. I recognise that's a good change. That's one step. But yeah.
The second thing is we didn't take legal advice about protecting Paul McDowell's position. We took legal advice about what was the appropriate thing to do, bearing in mind that we were talking about a competition which had barely started at the point when this decision was being made. It was 12 months before we reached the conclusion.
But would you have taken that legal advice if Paul McDowell had not applied for the job?
The legal advice was about conflicts of interest. So it wasn't about protecting him in terms of conflicts of interest. It was in terms of us, what was an appropriate thing to proceed with. It wasn't, let's take some advice about how to protect Paul McDowell because he's applied. It was a person who has applied has this potential conflict of interest. What is the appropriate way to proceed?
But it's so complicated, that actually the easiest thing would be for him not to have applied or to at that point had the discussion.
Many things might have happened in the 12 months between when we made the appointment and the point where we made those commercial decisions. And the Justice Select Committee, after we wrote to them again when it became apparent that this conflict of interest was not manageable, actually wrote and said, I repeat what the committee said about his suitability for his job and his abilities, and I dissociate myself from any attack on his integrity. So
absolutely.
The Justice Select Committee were really clear that he had behaved quite properly.
I give the man credit for going quickly when it all happened, and presumably with no salary, but I just think this could have been foreseen, and there's a sort of thing that maybe those of us in elected office think about a lot more than other people, but it was the sort of thing that that there would have been jobs I wouldn't have taken, or my other half would have resigned from, in order to manage that.
I think that business of managing conflicts of interest where the conflict exists is absolutely common practice. That is quite common in public appointments, that at the point when you are making the appointment, there is a potential conflict of interest or a conflict of interest because of something that exists at the time.
But she already
the issue here was there were two uncertainties: what would happen to his wife and what would happen to the competition. Both of those could have gone in either direction, which would have resulted in no conflict arising. And we would have been excluding him on the basis that two possibilities were going to land up in the same place.
How are you covering his job now, and what's it costing?
We have an acting inspector covering the job now, and we are going to advertise.
Is that funded out of the existing? How much is the acting inspector costing? Is that from within the department?
It's from within the department, yes.
Yeah, but it's extra because he's got 6 months.
He did get 6 months. Oh, he didn't go off in that. Okay.
He got 6 months.
I want to ask Mr. Vine a
even though
question
he chose to go. Okay.
Before I unfortunately have to go off and do a piece of delegated legislation in a moment. Mr. Vine, you said I'm in the odd position of having to inspect a government department. Can you just expand on that slightly? Do you mean as opposed to inspecting an executive agency, or what?
Yes, I mean it is reflected in the report that one of the unique features that now exists with the role that I formerly had was that, of course, my reports directly impact on the Home Office.
Yes.
Because it's obviously a consequence of the immigration function being brought back into the Home Office in the way it was, I suppose, before the, as it was when the IND existed in 2007.
I just thought it was a very direct analogue. In fact, when the National Lords Office reported on the foreign national prisoners affair and the management of failed asylum applicants in 2006. The Immigration Nationality Directorate was referred to in that report. The analogue is that the Controller and Auditor General reports on government departments, reports on executive agencies, reports on the whole gamut of public expenditure,
yes,
and reports to Parliament, and here's Mr. Phillips's point, is funded by a commission of Parliament that decides what his budget is, completely independent of anybody else, although that commission takes advice from others, including from the Treasury, but then it decides and tells the Treasury what size cheque to write for the National Audit Office, and there is complete constitutional separation. That's not to say that the National Audit Office doesn't live in a real world. It's not to say that it hasn't thought it wise to cut its budget in some places, and in fact it started doing so some years before some government departments because it wanted to be trim. Are you saying that that type of arrangement might be of wider application elsewhere and might possibly be appropriate for various inspectorates?
Well, it might be. The fact is that since the inspectorate was created, against the background that it was created against, it's changed. The landscape has changed. It's changed largely because the reports that we've published, which have had an impact on both creating border force and also bringing the immigration function back into the department. That means that the reports that I've produced, some of which have been very positive, others of which have not been so positive, really come hard and fast to the Home Office, the door of the Home Office. And whilst, as I've said previously in this hearing, I've not had any difficulty in my relationship with the Home Office, I have some concerns about publication, which we've been through. I do think it leaves this inspectorate in a slightly different position than most other inspectorates here. And it would be presumptuous of me to compare the Border and Immigration Inspectorate with the National Audit Office, but yes, in that respect, perhaps there's a similarity.
Mr. Hardwick, would you answer the same question? Do you think that kind of, as it were, constitutional architecture that I've described would be applicable to other inspectorates in a way that would be helpful?
Certainly what I would like to see for my inspectorate. So while I'm not quite in the same position as the Immigration Inspectorate, I'm inspecting like one executive agency of the department who sponsors me. It'd be noted the Secretary of State takes a very direct interest in the work of the prison service at quite a detailed level. I certainly think he takes some of my recommendations to heart in different ways, so he tells me vigorously. I think that I think there is a real conflict. I think we should be separate. I don't think there should be any suggestion I have to look over my shoulder and think about the impact of what I'm saying on the department and norms, other than are they doing what I want? That should be the question in my mind, not what's it going to do to my budget, can I recruit the staff I want, etc.
Okay.
And just to say, can I just make two other quick ones? One is, I think whatever constitutional arrangements you have, as Sir Tom was saying, actually it's the way you conduct yourself in the role I think is probably more important. And secondly, it's not just the big things that matter, it's little things like the Ministry of Justice is a large bureaucracy employing thousands of people. I'm trying to run a much smaller, dispersed organisation, and sometimes just the structures of a big organisation don't fit with what I'm trying to do. It's nobody's fault, and we sort of make it work, but that is really difficult. So, and I think we would be more efficient, actually, if we could be separated out and have the sort of arrangement, something similar to happens for the NN.
I want to come on to impact. Are you on appointment still?
Yes, I just want to ask a question which I hope is meant, because it's something we didn't raise in our report, which is code of practice. I'm actually not sure. I mean, I don't doubt the honourable behaviour of all the inspectors. I really don't at all. But I actually am not quite sure whether you're covered by the Civil Service Code or what. I mean, we had this, we were having this discussion, and I wasn't quite sure whether you were, what you'd consider, if you were saying, I'm going to have a look at the book that tells me, now you might say if you need to look in a book, you've got a problem. But if you just set it aside from it, exactly what is it that is, if somebody was saying to you, this is not allowed under the rules, what rules are we talking about exactly? I'm sorry, I don't think that's a cavilling point. It's quite a significant question. I'm not sure what the answer to it is. And perhaps you know.
There are, of course, the standards of public life, the 7 standards of, and from that point of view,
are these gentlemen civil servants? Is that what you're saying?
No. No, we're not civil servants.
Crown appointment.
Yes.
If I could just add, I think one of the weaknesses of the current arrangements is not merely that, it's not just the risk that, in a sense, the department interferes in things it shouldn't, but that there is nobody interfering in things where they should interfere. So the kind of governance arrangements, are we, who would, if we were breaching some rules, how do we get held to account in a way that people don't affect our, things affect our independence public? Or if, for instance, we were being frivolous with the money, how would that, would the governance arrangements work well enough? Or would, in a sense, the proper, I think sometimes, distance the MOJ want to put between us and them, so they want to preserve our independence, would that be an impediment to, in a sense, proper accountability for the practicalities of what we do? And I think that's another reason why actually it would be healthier if we were moved out of the department, because then we could be, in a sense, challenged on the things that we should be challenged on.
I mean, there are 2 options. Either you do it all under Cabinet Office, when you could get, learn from the best and get some uniformity of approach, or you do it through to Parliament. Those are the 2 options. Can I move on to impact? Now, inevitably, Sir Tom, I'm not being leaving you out, but I've got more material from the 1 resigned and 2 resigning inspectors than I have from the man who's still in the job and wants to continue in the job, which says something in a way. But if I can say a little bit, John Vine, you've said in an interview that I saw with The Independent that you still believe the system's beset with problems, poor management, lax record keeping, inconsistent decision making. I've picked those out as 3. I think we round this table would concur wholeheartedly with those observations. And so you've been saying this now for however many years you've been around there, and plus ça change. So what is it that needs to happen to secure improvements? And if I can go to Nick Hardwick, because you've just said as well in your annual October report, in June actually, you blamed political and policy failures for dangerous overcrowding. And then in your October report, you reported that prison policy, along with staff shortages, population prejudice, I'm probably taking a bit of liberty with your words, population pressures and legal highs were all contributing to serious problems in prisons, including a 69% rise in the suicide rate from 52 in 2012-13 to 88 in 13-14. And then you go on to say, looking at Oakwood, that there are plans to open a number of large establishments in the coming year. I recommend that ministers undertake and publish a review of the difficulties Oakwood and other new prisons experienced after they opened, and ensure the lessons learned are factored into plans for the opening of other new establishments. Now, I'm giving those as two examples of where one might say your impact would be less than you would have wanted. And I want you just to talk about that a little bit, and how you think there could be improvements in the way that the inspectors' function works to get a better impact out of the recommendations you make.
Well, I think from my point of view, I would say that we've had a tremendous impact in a number of different ways. First of all, in a very simple way, there's a lot more information in the public domain as a result of my inspection reports about borders and immigration than there ever was. And many of the stakeholders that I've dealt with, whether they be the airline industry, the shipping industry, asylum and refugee groups, the university sector, a myriad of stakeholders have welcomed the fact that they can now find out about what's actually happening. So the reports have put information into the public domain, which enables people then to hold the Home Office and the immigration authorities to account. The reports have also led to direct changes in the immigration structure. The report on border control, which identified weaknesses at Heathrow and inconsistency at the border, led to the separation out of border force structurally, but it's also resulted in much more consistency in border checking across the UK. When I did my investigation into border controls, commissioned by the Home Secretary in 2012, 12 recommendations, all accepted, laid before Parliament, have led to much greater consistency of checking at the border. There's also been improvement, because I looked at visas, the way visas are issued, certainly an improvement in quality of decision-making in visa posts across the world. And of course, the report I did on the follow-up on asylum backlog led to the abolition of the agency and the whole immigration function being brought back in. So I don't think anybody could argue that we've not had an impact in that respect. Where I think there's still tremendous room for improvement is in the areas I outlined in my annual report to Parliament, laid in December. I think there needs to be far more concentration on getting the basics right consistently. The three immigration directorates need to work together rather than be separate immigration directorates. There needs to be oversight of where the synergies are between those directorates. There needs to be much more quality assurance by managers of what's happening. It shouldn't need an inspector to go in to actually find some of the things that I've found and have published. It's just about good management. And I think that's partly because in this area, in order to provide an effective service, we need managers who will stay the course in operational posts and have a good professional knowledge and good leadership skills. And in general terms, I'm not entirely sure that that's what the civil service does. I mean, a lot of civil servants like to move on, they like to move into policy roles. They see that as much more of a career progression. So getting good people in the front line with the proper management and leadership skills and having a consistency of approach is important. And at the end of the day, some of the fact is that whilst I've not tried to, in many of my reports, comment on resources, because I think you can always do more with the resources you have, at the end of the day, if we're going to have 100% checking of things, we need properly skilled staff and enough of them to do the job effectively.
I mean, it's a bit scary that we discovered even just this weekend that one of the girls who came out, who's left the UK to go to Turkey and possibly on to Syria, travelled on her sister's passport, isn't it?
Well, yes, if that is the case, clearly, if that is what has been revealed.
And why are you leaving, if you're having all this impact?
Well, I decided I'd leave at the time of my 6th annual report, and I thought it was a good opportunity to hand over to my successor so that he or she could be in place in order to present an inspection plan for a new administration. I mean, my third contract was due to expire in June. I anticipated that with PERDA cutting in March, there would be very little that I could publish, and I thought this was a good time to hand over. After 6.5 years, And previous to that 8.5 years as a Chief Constable, I actually want to do something else.
Nick, Hardwick. And then we'll come back
on
impact.
On the two specifics you mentioned, first of all, I mean, about, in a sense, the wider kind of climate about what's happening in prisons. I think one of the things that is absolutely right in the NAO report and their first finding is about what they describe, I think, as the, and I quote, the profound cultural impact of regular inspection. And I didn't kind of invent the way we do it, I just kind of took it over. But there's no doubt in my mind that having a consistent set of standards and establishments knowing we're going to turn up again and again and again, over decades now, checking the same thing, that we will then publish what we find and that will be exposed, has an impact, has a profound impact. And what they say to us is, things have got worse, but they would be a lot worse without you providing that kind of shield of standards that we do. It was interesting, I had a letter just the other day from the Prison Governors Association saying they'd had a motion at their last conference saying that they should come to us and ask us to reduce our standards. And it had been rejected unanimously because they wanted us to keep saying what we were saying and doing what we were doing because it helped them fend things off. So I think it's a great, I think it does help. Of course, we'd like to do more. And just on that general thing, what I feel very frustrated about is I do think, almost nobody now goes to prisons and immerses themselves in them in the way that I do and my team do. Right? We have a real depth of knowledge about what's happening. And I don't think, if I were starting again, I would like to do more to use that. I don't think we could do more to spread good practice, to try and draw some lessons together. Might need a little tiny bit more resources to do some of that, but we could do more of that. I think it's a bit of a wasted trick there, and I would do more if I could. If I had the time, I'd do that. On the point about Oakwood, I think Oakwood's quite a good example. To be fair to Oakwood, there are two bits about that. One is that we've just published a report on Oakwood. Some of the press coverage of that was unfair because the people there had worked like maniacs to improve it. And I, take my hat off. They had made real improvements. Long way to go still, but actually a lot of people, right down on the shop floor, as it were, done really well. And what they said to us, so I wouldn't want to take credit away from them at all, but they would say that our inspection last time helped them with that process and provided them with some platform to do that. But it's the people on the ground that do it. But on your point about learning lessons, I don't want to lose this. I am frustrated at the response to this. What we know that the fact is a critical factor about the prisons that have failed is not that they're run by G4S or that they're big, it's that they're new. Right? It takes too long to get places up to speed and working properly. And I do think we could look at what happened to Thamesmead, what happened to Oakwood when it opened, what happened to ISIS, what happened to Doncaster some time ago. And I think there are some common factors there, learning, that could be applied to new prisons when they open in future. And I'm a bit frustrated. There's a kind of reluctance to do that because people don't like to admit anything ever goes wrong. We could do that better. There are lessons to be learnt. There's money to be saved apart from anything else. Some of that's about how you organise it. Some of it's about how you commission those early stages. And that's a frustration, I think, that it's a missed opportunity. And I hope other people will take that forward in future.
Do you want to say about impact? I haven't got any quotes because you've been even more discreet than the others.
The Inspectorate of Constabulary now carries out the greatest level of reporting directly to the public in terms they can understand than it has ever done in its 159-year history. We tell the public about the performance of their police forces in terms that they can understand. That leads to elected representatives, police and crime commissioners, and of course the Home Office, and of course just public opinion applying real pressure on the police to improve. And it does lead to improvements in policing, and I can give a number of examples. And if these improvements to policing do take place in efficiency and effectiveness, it means that we can have more and better policing for the same money or less money that will protect children and vulnerable people. It will enable the police to be more effective and therefore spend more time on their primary purpose, which is preventing crime, and therefore preventing people becoming victims. And of course, the more prevention the police can do, the more money will be saved, because almost all the costs of the criminal justice system are incurred upstream of the, downstream of the offence being committed. So overall, and this is a very general point, inspection can lead to the material improvements in police efficiency and effectiveness, which saves money, but more importantly, saves lives being devastated by crime.
65.9% of the increase in your budget will relate to the annual inspections, or are there other elements that are going to be included in that new spend?
The increase is to enable us to do what is called the PEEL programme, which is police efficiency, effectiveness and legitimacy. And it enables us now to establish, completely reconfigure and re-engineer in the inspectorate. So our base load work is the annual inspections going to every one of 43 forces and looking at the same things every year and determining for local people whether things are getting better, whether they're getting worse, how well money is being spent. That's going to be our base load work. And on top of that, we will do thematic reports into particular problems that have arisen, most recently, for example, on crime recording, child protection, domestic abuse, undercover policing, etc.
Thanks.
I want to come to Mr. Sedwill and Dame Ursula, please. One of this committee's principal functions is to look at value for money. Now, neither of your departments, you've both got these inspectorates working under you. You've both got very good civil servants, excellent economists who carry out impact assessments as to what things you're proposing are going to achieve in the future. Neither of your departments measures the impact of the work these inspectorates actually does on the bodies that they're inspecting. Why not?
Can I have a go first? One of the things that, the reasons that would be difficult is because inspections of individual prisons...
Right, sorry, so the answer is it's too difficult, is that right?
No, it's not that it's too difficult.
Right, let's answer the question I asked to start with, Dame Ursula, and then you can explain why.
The way we evaluate the impact of the inspections is on the improvement of the prisons, but it is difficult to identify how much of the improvement is down to the visible result of the inspection and how much is down to something which is to do with the fact that there is a standard, because particularly in relation to prisons there is an agreed standard that prisons measure themselves against. Whether an inspection happens or not, prisons are seeking to move themselves up the ranking against that standard. So it would be difficult to say, did this inspection result in the movement of the prison in the case of Oakwood, say, because actually in the case of Oakwood knows what the standard is, knows that an inspection will come at some point, and is working towards improving itself. So it is quite difficult to separate out.
You've explained that it's quite difficult. I understand that. Now, the question I asked, if you would, please, why don't you, that's all I want an answer to at the moment, why don't you measure the impact of what the inspectorate that Mr. Hardwick was heading up, why don't you measure the impact of what it's doing?
I'm not sure in what way we would do that. We
measure it. The answer is it's too difficult. Is that the answer? That's all I'm asking.
I don't know whether it's too difficult or whether it just wouldn't be productive to try and to differentiate out how much of an improvement in a prison is down to inspection.
Potential answers. It's too difficult or it's not productive. Is it one? Is it both? Just what is the answer to the question that I'm asking, Dame Ursula? We've had this before. You're coming to give evidence to this committee. Please listen to the question and please give me an answer.
I don't know how we would do an impact assessment of the impact of prison inspection reports other than what we already have, which is to measure the improvement in individual prisons.
Right. Mr. Sedwill, could you know the question that I'm asking. Why don't you do the impact?
Because I don't see that assessing the separate impact of inspections would actually tell me anything useful compared to actually implementing the recommendations.
Well, one of the things it would tell you is whether or not the money you're spending on the inspectorates is money well spent, which is where I came at this question from.
No, I understand that, but I think if you look, I mean, it might, but in the end, the inspectors themselves bid for the budgets they set. The NEO, Amias and I had some correspondence over this. I think it is genuinely quite difficult to assess the VFM of inspectorates. But if you want to think about the resource question, when Sir Tom and I looked at the proposal from the Inspectorate of Constabulary to increase their budget, we looked at not in a scientific way, but we looked at the expected impact that we would get in terms of better public reassurance, more detailed inspections of forces, and the budget that would be required for that. That's not we're not doing a separate sort of VFM exercise, where we are trying to look at impact when we look at that. If I can put it the other way around, when John suggested he could maintain his impact, but with slightly fewer resources, reduce the number of inspectors again. So it's a conversation of that kind rather than a sort of formal assessment.
Do you think it might be worthwhile, in the light of this questioning or this line of questioning, actually just to explore the possibility of whether, on a regular basis, perhaps annually, you could have a look at the value for money in terms of the impact that these inspectorates that your department has are having?
I'd like to take it away, Mr. Phipps, because what I'm really interested in is the impact of implementing their recommendations. That's our focus, really, rather than actually what the specific role of the inspectorates is. Not least because I wouldn't expect us necessarily to make significant decisions off the back of that analysis, but I'm definitely happy to reflect on it.
Well, I may or may not be. Sorry.
Sorry, coming on this, because I was a minister in the Home Office when Mr. Vine was inspector and been in opposition. And so I've been on both sides of the fence, so to speak. And it seems to me that some excellent reports have come out. Some real, genuine attempts by ministers and civil servants to do some good things in immigration. But basically, the same problem is there, that there's a lot of very slow processing. There are mixed decisions. People might have still got constituents who've been waiting a lifetime, nearly. Well, for the children, a lifetime to they're getting to go to university and they can't because they've not got their situation settled. That backlog is still there, despite the inspection reports, despite some wills. Now, what is it that's stopping those repeated inspection reports actually delivering a result? Isn't it just down to money in the end, and actually partly political will, that all of us, whatever political party, never want to chuck enough money at the problem to solve it, or we do, but it means you put it out of another area. Isn't that really the truth?
Well, I mean, you're never going to get me
I know you're not resigning, so you're not going to say that.
You're never going to be sitting here saying that I couldn't do more money, more people, more time, more bandwidth, etc. I couldn't do a better job, of course. But we live in the world we live in, and we're in a period of austerity now.
Okay,
so
forget the money. I agree with what Mr. Vine says. It's about management and the level and skill of management.
I agree with that, and I think Mr. Vine said I won't rehearse it again. Set out actually a list of significant improvements that have been made, and we can attribute directly to the work of him and his inspectorate, and large parts.
So,
of the border immigration system have improved.
So the bits of the system Mr. Vine highlighted as improving, a lot of what he highlighted there was actually about structural change. There's a debate there about whether that will actually lead to improvements. He made recommendations. Home Office changed structures. But look, just give one example. Now, here's a long time ago, so you'll tell me it's not relevant. I read a newspaper when I was a minister. There was a letter published in the newspaper because an MP was cross that it had gone out to the constituent. And it had gone out in my name. And I read the letter in the newspaper, thought, I didn't send that letter out. I'm sure I didn't send that letter out. And I was right. It had gone out in error, without my signature, without my sight. And it was an inappropriate letter. And anyway, after another repeat problem, we discovered that a lot of the staff in the department weren't actually literate enough to write proper letters. That was a serious, and for me as a minister, it was very frustrating because I knew this was a problem before it was unearthed. We would repeatedly raised the concerns. But it was by then a management problem, so all the staff had to be retrained, which took, not just months, but much longer. It went beyond my time when I finally left, still going on probably. And those staff had been served poorly by not being well managed, and the whole system had served everybody badly because of those problems. Now, that wasn't rocket science from the beginning. It's great Mr. Vine's looked at this and shone a light on it, but it shouldn't have actually taken an inspectorate to pick up those problems, and it certainly shouldn't be still happening. There are still problems now.
Well, I don't think that problem is there anymore. Look, I think
hopefully by now, after 7 years, that's now.
But this is I think this is the point, Ms. Hilliard, that inspectors do shine a light. One of my frustrations is when an inspector comes across something that our management haven't identified themselves in the past, and I take action with the management concerned, because it shouldn't be the case that these things come as a surprise. But we are dealing with a system that has been through many, many problems. I genuinely think it is improving, but you know well, it's not just the restructuring. So John Vine referred to the operating mandate and the 100% check at the border that was introduced directly following one of his reports. I think that's right, isn't it, John? So there is an increase in quality, in both the quality and quantity of checks at the border as a result of an inspection report. And those improvements are telling. And if you look at our controls compared to other countries, actually they do bear up pretty well, notwithstanding all of the problems which I entirely acknowledge.
Can I just ask, okay, fair enough, it's not an inspection point. Well, it is partly. I think the stuff about processing is still not dealt with, because it's sexier to do the border controls and politically more palatable than it is to actually deal with poor constituents in Hackney who've been waiting a decade or 15 years to find their status settled and who are living in absolute hell and limbo. So I'll just make my point.
Whether or not it is frustrating for him to hear Dame Ursula say that it's not productive to evaluate the impact of his reports. What does that say to him in terms of?
Well, to be honest, I accept it is difficult to work out the impact, and as I said before, I'm cautious about attributing impact to us. It's people on the ground who deliver it. But I do want to make this point. I don't think actually the most important part of our impact is the reports and the recommendations. I think the most important part of our impact is the kind of cultural impact, is the fact that we have these standards, the fact you're there in your prison, we're going to turn up at some point, and you don't know when, and you want to be ready. Success for us is not going to a place and finding lots of things wrong. Success is when we go somewhere and they've done it right before we get there, because we might turn up. And when you see that, that's what kind of warms the cockles of your heart. And that applies to the other forms of custody we do. So actually, if we go somewhere and we find, this is really terrible, I always regard that as a bit of a failure, because we should have got there sooner, we should have spotted that before. Success is when they do it right because they know we're coming. In the same way, if with the National Audit Office we had known what they were going to be looking at 2 years ago, I would have had it all in place. I would have worked to have done it before they got there. And then if they came back every 2 or 3 years asking the same questions, you bet I would have got that right. And we have that impact on the places.
John Vine, then I've got two more, and then I think we're in now.
Just very briefly, Chair. I would support what Nick said. It is really what's happened with the Home Office in the immigration space is that they are much more mature in terms of preparing for inspection, and that's a real triumph for inspection, because they're looking in advance of inspection to put things right, which is what I did when I was a Chief Constable. I knew the police inspector was going to visit. So that maturity is leading to improvements in itself. The fact that I proposed to go, actually makes things happen behind the scenes. But I think Meg Hillier is right in the sense that very often, on the downside, process takes over from actually people standing back and seeing the wood from the trees. The report I did, for example, on nationality and citizenship released before Christmas was a classic example of that, where the requirements of the British Nationality Act weren't being complied with. Because it was process, let's get the job done, but actually somebody at a senior level should be sitting back and saying, well, what are we achieving here? But there is improvement, it's more maturing, and it's actually quite good to go back into the workplace, see people working hard, and see that they've actually prepared for us to come.
So does that mean, could I just finish on this, does that mean that you are relaxed about the lack of individual assessment in terms of impact, because what you see yourself doing is driving cultural change?
Well, I think you need to look at a number of different things. So for instance, the way we assess our impact, we look at what actually the outcomes are of inspections, we look at the degree to which they've implemented our recommendations, and we publish all of that, and we look at the feedback we get. So we get feedback from people that's pretty positive. You put those together and say, yeah, that's a reasonable picture. But I would be, I think there's a real difficulty about saying, look, it's just down to us that this change happened, because there's always a variety of people who've had an influence on it. So I think if you had a very crude measure, I think that might lead you in the wrong direction. I think you have to use some judgment in coming to views about impact. It's not a arithmetical exercise, I would say.
Mark, very quickly, I'm trying to finish us by...
Can I finish my one point?
Yeah, no, I've got two. You've got one. Mark's coming
So,
in on that.
Quick point. I mean, at the risk of irritating the committee by flattering you, the part of the impact is the public scrutiny. It's the coupling of inspections. I think there's one thing perhaps was slightly underplayed in the report, because the report has looked at inspections in their own terms. But actually, when you sit where I sit, it's the coupling of the reports with parliamentary scrutiny, media scrutiny, public scrutiny that actually enables one to drive the system, because you know the realities of politics much better than I. That is a very powerful lever. I thought it was just worth registering that point.
I want to ask two questions of Mark Sedwill and Dame Ursula. One is, what comes out of this report is that the varying standards on implementation. So if you look at who reviews and processes the implementation, who reviews and approves the implementation plan, how much sharing of good practice there is, all these sort of issues are just not they're not consistent across the 5 inspectorates. So I really wanted you to sort of address that, because it seems to me you've got these. I think what we're after is learning from the best among the inspectors as well, and it would be sensible, it seems to me, if both departments had a go at trying to see whether you couldn't build a more consistent approach, learning from what works best once their reports are written.
Do you want to go first this time?
Yes, I think I would agree with that. Recognising the variety, the Chief Inspector of Constabulary, of course, is looking at police forces. In a sense, we're not part of the inspection regime. Indeed, the Secretary of State is part of being assured, as well as the public, by those inspections. Whereas with the Chief Inspector of Immigration, we're the subject of the inspection. So there are some differences, but fundamentally I think you are absolutely right. And we've tried in the past couple of years, and I hope John would endorse this, to ensure that the recommendations for which we're responsible within the department are entrenched in a much more central way in the change programmes that we're overseeing.
And considered by your Risk and Audit Committee?
And exactly. So they are looked at by internal audit. There's a full programme goes to the Audit and Risk Committee, and indeed it reports into my executive.
Do you want to add to that?
Only to say, I think there is more to be done in terms of learning good practice across the inspectorates. The inspectorates do some of that themselves. I think the departments do need to do more of that, and one of the things that will come out of this is that we will do more of that. Something that I will be anxious not to lose is that the Inspectorate of Prisons has a particular role, because of the fact that people's liberty is being taken away from them, that has a set of standards which is very distinct. And I wouldn't want us in any way to get to a sort of consistency that lost that somehow. So we will recognise that actually these inspectors are doing different things when they're doing that. And on the third point on audit, yes, I think we have a system for following up prison inspectorate recommendations, but getting the audit committee to look at them as they do in other recommendations like those from the National Audit Office, where we say how many are outstanding and why, is a good move that we will now follow up.
Good. And Nick wants to add
just very briefly, I agree about the point about looking at closed institutions is a bit different. The other point I wouldn't want the committee to lose sight of is that, in fact, for us, our key partners are Ofsted and CQC. Those are the people we work most with, rather than the criminal justice inspectorates. And if you have too narrow a focus on just our criminal justice partners, who are important, you risk actually pulling us further away from the other people we need to work with. So I think I would just urge you don't have too narrow a focus on this, because that might distort
brings me
things.
neatly to my second point on inspectorates working together, and I just thought about the 5 there and took the issue of whether that's working well enough, or whether we couldn't make steps to improve on that. If you take the issue of rape, so you've got the police who are responsible for catching offenders, they refer them to CPS. We know from the stats that whilst reporting of rape is up, that there are fewer arrests and many fewer convictions. We know the prison service and probation service is responsible for the rehabilitation and prevention of reoffending. And 1 in 7 convicted rapists have a previous offence on a sex crime. And we know that it's an issue in immigration, that of those trafficked to the UK, 41% were trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. So there's a classic issue which goes across all 5 inspectorates. how can you improve the joint working there on an issue which is really important to again improvement in the working of the agencies, both separately and together? I think it's for you, Mark, and Dame Ursula, really.
In relation to the joint working across those kind of criminal justice issues, there is the Criminal Justice Joint Inspection Group. I think,
but it doesn't do a lot, does it?
But, it has produced a lot of thematic reports, and some of them have been really invaluable. There was one on multi-agency public protection agreements, which was really important and has led to changes in the way that we're doing that work. I think the really critical thing, as Nick Hardwick was saying, is making sure that we don't just say we've got a theme and everybody has got to do their bit of it, because sometimes the truth is across the CJS things will land more obviously between police and prosecutors with rather less significant implications, say, for prisons. But we do have a regime where ministers get together with the inspectors to talk about what we ought to be doing in terms of cross-cutting themes, and rape is an example of one that I'm sure will be on the agenda when we have that next discussion.
I've almost nothing to add. I think just listening to you set out the question, Madam Chair, I was thinking of how we're wrestling with the whole question of child sex abuse, which of course stretches well beyond the criminal justice system into public health and education and local government and so on. And I think we are wrestling with that at a policy level to try and make the system connect horizontally in a way that it frankly hasn't done effectively in the past. And I think you're absolutely right. We're going to need the kind of independent scrutiny of that, both now to help us identify the problems and as we try to address those problems. We'll need some kind of coherent independent scrutiny across the system. I think we need to give that some thought. So I would just really echo your point.
So, Tom?
I've just been appointed, probably as the last man standing, as the chairman of the Criminal Justice Chief Inspectors Group. And it does a lot. 40% of the Inspectorate of Constabulary's work is joint inspection work. Yes, there is more we could do to ensure that we learn from one another, that we share good practice, that we have joint training, and we are doing that. We have common methodology, we have standard approaches to a number of things, and we as the Chief Inspectors have also just decided just before Christmas that we would establish a common web portal accessible to all of our staff so that we can see what everyone is doing. We can also ensure that it minimises the effect on police forces and other institutions so that we all know when their inspectors are going in. And insofar as possible, we can achieve the greatest level of efficiency, economy and effectiveness in inspection, but also ensure that our staff benefit from learning from one another. So there is more we can do. That is adverted to in the National Audit Office report. It's something we resolved to do before Christmas, and we will do it.
Well, one very quick one. Meg Hillier's discussion about literacy reminded me of a dreadful constituency case where I had the judgment of an immigration tribunal chairman, which contained 71 typographical errors, and in some cases so many, so close together and so bad that you couldn't figure out what it was that was being sought to be said. You couldn't interpret it. And indeed, the final page of the tribunal judgment appeared to be, well, didn't appear to be, it was from a totally different case of a prior date involving a different individual from a different country. And my question is, Mr. Vine, I suspect that the answer to this is no, but am I right in thinking you do not inspect immigration tribunals?
That's correct. No,
right,
I didn't.
Okay. So who does? Is it the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office?
If it was concerning the performance of an individual judge who was chairing a tribunal, yes, it would be.
Right. So if I wanted to raise a case of a particular judge, then it should be with the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office. I was so shocked by it. I mean, I don't know how representative it might be, but if it's even remotely representative of the quality of first-tier tribunals in the immigration area, then it is really quite concerning. Have you come across other similar cases where, in this space, in the immigration tribunal space specifically,
I haven't heard of one as vivid as that, Mr. Bacon, but I will take it away and actually identify it. It hasn't been brought to my attention, but it sounds like it should have been.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just before, Mr. Sedwill, don't forget about the measuring the impact of these
No,
various inspectorates, because if I'm fortunate enough to be re-elected and returned, and indeed on this committee, I'm not going to forget about it.
Mr. Phillips, your tenacity is already apparent.
Inspectors who are departing.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for what I would say. Thank you very much. And thank you really for, it's so refreshing to have very open evidence. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
If I can keep my, where there's a vote at 5:15, so we'll try and do it by. Nice. Is it being